Sego everyone, Chief Sherry Lynn Hill here. Nyawa, thank you for tuning in to the weekly Chief and Council radio show. In response to Minister Galmasti's interview, which some of you may have heard on CKRZ on April 9, 2026, the Indigenous Services Canada Minister Mandy Galmasti called in to speak about a historic agreement. The historic agreement she spoke about was the result of a 19-year legal battle whereby the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, or CKRZ, affirmed that Canada was found to be discriminating against First Nations children in care on a national level. In 2019, the CKRZ ordered compensation for impacted children and their families. In 2023, Canada and First Nations negotiated a $23 billion plus national settlement, which included long-term reform of child and family services. Unfortunately, First Nations throughout Canada could not unanimously agree on the national settlement. So, Anishinaabe Nation and the Chiefs of Ontario pushed forward with support of Ontario First Nations leadership and service providers for a regional agreement designed to reflect and meet the needs of First Nations located in the province of Ontario. In 2026, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal approved the legally binding Ontario Final Agreement, which aims to eliminate systematic discrimination by having First Nations in Ontario leading and transforming child and family services reform to their communities. So yes, I agree with Minister Galmasti. The Ontario Final Agreement is indeed historic and a huge win for First Nations located in Ontario. Minister Galmasti mentioned that under a reformed system, we would be seeing our children grow up in a system that is designed and driven by First Nations, but also rooted in culturally grounded, community-led care. She said the system will protect our children at one of the most vulnerable and challenging times of their lives. And the new system will protect their identities and empower them to grow up to be happy, healthy First Nations children. This is exactly the type of care that Anishinaabe Nation and the Chiefs of Ontario fought so hard for. But it can only come true if we have the freedom to utilize the settlement funding to meet and address the needs of our communities. Six Nations of the Grand River has received some of the CKRZ settlement money from Indigenous Services Canada since the 2019 decision. However, this settlement money has the same restrictions as program funding, with strict rules for spending and approvals, with a risk of having to send money back if it's not spent by year-end. The settlement dollars come to First Nations communities as an amendment to their funding agreements with very strict parameters around how it can be spent. Budgets to spend the settlement money are heavily scrutinized, requiring a significant amount of detail. Budget approvals take months to be reviewed, and there is a growing list of ineligible expenditures, much the same as we see with funding agreements. And lastly, the settlement money, there should never be the threat of having to return unspent funding. But since the settlement money comes to the community as part of a funding agreement, there is always an end date and deadlines to spend. Minister Galmasti indicated that Indigenous Services Canada wants to respect and uphold communities and support them with the next steps moving forward as more details of the Ontario Final Agreement, the $8.5 billion, are released. This kind of support is welcome. However, it's been our experience so far that the terms and conditions of the settlement agreement and the framework are still preventing systematic changes and meaningful ways to build the infrastructure and foundation needed for true reform that is needed for our children, their families, and our communities. In closing, it is encouraging to hear the minister talk on the radio about wanting to respectfully engage and support First Nations with the next steps in seeing First Nations in Ontario leading and transforming child and family services reform. However, based on our experience with CHRT settlement money, I invite Minister Galmasti to join us here at Six Nations of the Grand River to discuss and work towards resolving the concerns and challenges we continue to experience. Nyawa to all of you for tuning in and listening to the Chief and Council radio show. Until our next episode, take care, be safe, be well, and be kind.